Okay, well, this is talk 15 in the Judgment Seat of Christ series, and I'm continuing on the overall theme at the moment of operating in our own strength, operating in the flesh, and what is that? How do we know we're doing that? Why shouldn't we do that? And how do we address that problem as Christians? Okay, well, so far in what I've been saying in talk 14, I've been focusing on people who have a lot of self-confidence and an excessive and unhealthy belief in their own abilities. And there are such people. And I was one of those. And such a person is obviously operating in the flesh. If you've got that sort of excessive gung-ho, can-do, nothing that will stop you, get on with it, in a hurry, everything's urgent kind of approach, that's not godly, and that's not acting in the Spirit. And so, but what we mustn't do is imagine that the only way in which you can operate in the flesh is by doing that and being overconfident, gung-ho, urgent, driving, striving, and so forth. That's one way that we can operate in the flesh. But we can operate in the flesh in other ways too, at the other end of the spectrum. So there are many people, perhaps there are far more people, whose problem is quite the opposite. And for them, it's fear of failure, fear of criticism, fear of disapproval, fear of unpopularity, fear of everything. You fill in the blank. And such a person will be timid, afraid, nervous, anxious. They'll hold back. They won't do things. They won't try things. They won't use initiative. They won't take risks for God because they're afraid and worried and anxious and fretful and so on. And timid and in many ways you could say lacking confidence. Well, you might say, well then such a person is obviously a commendable Christian and has no pride and is therefore to be highly praised. Well, I wouldn't think so. Because think about it. What is it that makes a person lack confidence, be timid, be afraid to take a risk, be unwilling to try anything? What is it that makes a person completely unwilling to fail or to be seen to fail? It's pride, and it's just as much pride as makes the gung-ho people want to win a gold medal. So the fear of losing at the Olympics is just as much pride as the craving to win at the Olympics in an inappropriate and overemphasized way. It's pride that lies at the heart of both. And pride, remember, is one of the principal features of the flesh. So when we're operating in the flesh, we're going to be operating in pride, because that's the flesh's principal characteristic. So we mustn't imagine that those of us who are timid, fearful, hold back, never take a risk, never try to put ourselves forward, never allow anything to fail, are not proud. That's just as proud and just as much in the flesh as the opposite. Because you could say, well, if you're in that situation, then perhaps what you ought to say to yourself is, why am I more concerned about how I appear to others or what they might say about me than I am about being obedient to God and useful in his service? Now, who says that you've got to succeed? Where did you get the idea from that you've got to succeed in what you're doing? See, God has never called us to succeed. He's called us to be faithful and obedient. So if God calls you to do a thing, it is not a condition of your willingness to do it that you be guaranteed to succeed in it. That's not a valid proviso that you can insist upon in the contract with God. I'll do it if you can guarantee I'll succeed and won't look foolish. But if you won't guarantee that to me, I'm not doing it. Well, where did we get the idea from that we can talk in that way to God? And none of us put those words audibly out of our mouths, do we? But people think that. I'm not doing that if it makes me look foolish. I'm not doing that if I might fail. I'm not doing that because, I fear this and I fear that. So what we're called upon to do is to be faithful and obedient And if we therefore feel those things, my submission to you is that that equally is acting in the flesh as the gung-ho people who act independently and do all sorts of things they're not supposed to do. The person who won't do anything on the building site in case it's not good, well, what use is he on the building site? Do you see? He's almost as useless as the man who builds walls where they should not be. In a certain sense, God can do more with the wayward, willful person, because if he can break that person and get them to stop being wayward, they could be a good bricklayer. But the person that won't lay any bricks unless he can be guaranteed this and guaranteed that, well, what can God do with such a person who won't do anything? So, it's the same carnal means fleshly, focus upon self that causes a confident person to try to promote and project himself, as causes a timid, diffident person to hold back and avoid obeying God for fear of being reduced in the opinions of others, being a failure, etc. It's the same flesh nature. It's the same committee member that's bringing it about. And so that the flesh will act in the committee in accordance with the kind of person you are. So if you're uber confident, the flesh will urge you to do things that an uber confident person would do. If you're timid, the flesh will urge you to do the things that a timid person would do, or rather not to do the things that a timid person won't do. Either way, it's the same flesh nature, which keeps you focused on yourself, focused on what people think of you, rather than on God and what he wants of you. Okay? Now, another thing that the people who are in the flesh will do, and this applies to both groups, and in a certain sense it applies more to the timid and more to the nervous and more to those than it does to the gung-ho and the confident. And what I'm speaking of is, if we're in the flesh, people will get into manipulation and control and deception and so on in order to maintain or obtain power and control. And you might imagine that these things would be mostly manifested by your sort of alpha male type people who are mega people. In my personal experience, the alpha male people don't go much in for manipulation, deception. They don't go in for it. So what they tend to do is they just charge forward and tell people what they're doing and why they're doing it and charge forward. And they don't tend to be manipulative or duplicitous. What I've found personally is the ones who are like that are the timid people. And I write about it in book 6 that's coming out soon. And I give quite a few examples in there of ordinary folk, and I've deliberately gone for ordinary folk. Secretaries, people in law firms, people in, nurses and people like that who've done wicked things, deceitfully, manipulatively, controlling others, but doing it in a weaselly way. And that's the way that people operate if they are weak. So they use inappropriate things, inappropriate levers to make up for the fact that they're timid. So we mustn't imagine that the timid ones are never in the flesh. Timid people are frequently in the flesh, and a great deal of the manipulation and deception and control that goes on is done by such people. And I give many examples of it in book 6. Okay, let's just...
There is the saying, the quiet ones are the worst.
Yes, Elizabeth says the quiet ones are the worst. That can be true. And there's one particular secretary who absolutely astonished me with the extent of her spider's web of control. And she was the most mousy, little timid little thing. You wouldn't have thought she could say boo to a goose. And this is the thing. She never did say boo to any gooses. No goose was ever to hear the word boo being said by her. She used to do things always behind, in the shadows. She used to tell lies to one person to get them to fall out with another person that would get that person to leave the firm so that she could get a promotion into that job. And it was all done. If you were a snooker player, she used to pot the ball by, she'd pot using 9 reds to get the ball in. She could make that deflect off, that deflect off, that deflect off, that deflect off, that, and go into the pocket. And I thought, this girl could hardly pass any GCSEs, and yet she had the mind the size of a major planet.
Witchcraft.
Yes, witchcraft is the art of manipulation, domination, and control. But this girl had a mind that was well trained in all of that through years of practice. And she was a...
Sinister.
Sorry?
Sinister.
Yeah. Now, the point is, thick as 2 short planks in any other sense, couldn't pass exams, etc. But a real gold medalist when it came to that kind of ability to lie about things effortlessly and behind the scenes and maneuver and manipulate people. I found her in the end. I found out about her. And I've written quite a bit about her. So it all has a purpose. It's had a redemptive purpose because her planet-sized brain has enabled me to write some useful pages in book 6.
You're going to send her a copy?
No, I won't send her a copy. I don't name her. I don't name anybody. But it's an illustration of how even the worst things have a redemptive purpose. You can write about them, you can deal with them, you can teach about them. So she's going to be of benefit, unwittingly, to the kingdom, I hope, although she never intended it. So let's return to the theme of grabbing for things. Now this is an important theme. And this is more your gung-ho type of person, but not only. Because timid people can grab as well. Insecure people can grab, and frequently do. But if we're operating in the Spirit, when an opportunity comes, we can let God give it to us. If we're operating in the flesh, and an opportunity comes, or appears to come, we'll have a tendency to grab it. So grab hold of it, and also keep hold of it in an inappropriately impulsive and determined way, making it happen. And this is a test, because frequently what God will allow is He'll permit something to come into your life that is available. And you will, if you are acting in the flesh, you will immediately persuade yourself that because it's available, it must be from God. And because it's available, you must have it. And because it's available, you must have it now. And because other people might get it or want it, you must grab it now. Because if you don't grab it now, someone else might get it, and that would prevent God's will from happening. So you must grab it now and make sure you get it. Now, if that in any way approximates to your way of thinking, then you're acting in the flesh. So look at David and Saul in the Bible. King David, King Saul. Acted very opposite ways. And Saul sought to hold on to the kingdom through manipulation, through violence, through deception, and so on, as a way of holding on to what he had. And David was put through a severe test because God had told him he was going to be king. Samuel had told him he was going to be king of Israel. Now you'd imagine, if David's been told he's going to be king of Israel, you'd imagine that that's going to happen soon. But instead, it took years for David to become king of Israel. Moreover, you'd imagine that if David's been told he's going to be king of Israel, and then along come opportunities to become king of Israel, those opportunities must surely be from God. Because David had many opportunities to kill Saul and take the kingdom. Now you've got a man who's been told by Samuel that he's going to be king. He knows who the king is, it's Saul. He knows that when Saul dies, he'll be king. Well, if you had a small IQ, you would think this: if I kill Saul, I can be king. And that's what most of us would do. Most of us would have killed Saul, wouldn't we? Especially when Saul is going to the toilet just next to you and doesn't know you're there, and you could take his head off in 2 seconds and he would never know, and you could be king. And that's what David had the chance to do on a number of occasions, but he refused to take the kingdom in that way. And David is a classic example to us of how we should act, because David was operating in the Spirit. And that didn't mean that David always acted in the Spirit, because we also know the times he did not act in the Spirit, don't we? So David is living proof that the flesh is still on the committee, isn't he? Because later on, having acted in such an exemplary way to take the kingdom, he then fouled up in a single day later on, didn't he? That was the day when the flesh really, really spoke up on the committee that day and ruled everything that particular day. But just now, in this particular time, when David took the kingdom, he took it in the right way. So it wouldn't be, he didn't grab, he refused to grab, he let God give it to him in God's time. So anything, this is a point that you need to remember, anything that you grab for yourself, you must keep for yourself. So if you've grabbed it, you're going to have to keep it for yourself through witchcraft, manipulation, domination, control, intimidation of others. Because if you grabbed it, God will not cooperate with you in the things that you grabbed. And you'll have to keep it for yourself. So you'll end up losing it. This is the irony. That which you grab, you lose. That which you let God give to you, you keep. And so it's counterintuitive, very, very much so. Because everything in our flesh nature tells us that if we grab, we'll get. And if we manipulate and dominate and control and maneuver and deceive, we can keep. But it won't work. Moreover, not only will it not work here in this life, but it will certainly not impress Jesus at the judgment seat. And that's what we're talking about primarily. So even if you somehow manage to keep hold of a ministry for 20 or 30 years by manipulation, domination, control, deception, intimidation, maneuvering, and so forth, what's Jesus going to say to you at the judgment seat about the way you conducted that ministry, even if you kept hold of it? And what would you actually be keeping hold of? You'd be keeping hold of something that you made, that you grabbed, that you kept hold of. Well, what is it? When the Bunsen burner is applied to it in the crucible, it will burn up. So the whole thing is purposeless. If you're viewing this in the context of how it will all look at the judgment seat, because that's what matters, is how it will look at the judgment seat. So if you grab a thing, you grab a position, grab a role, grab a power, God will leave you to flounder. He'll let you flounder in that role because you grabbed it. You took it for yourself. It's not that God's unmerciful. In part he's acting in judgment, but in part he's acting in mercy. Because if he lets you flounder and fail, you might learn that that's not the right way to do it. So if you were to grab a thing age 20 or 30 and God let you fail and fall on your face and flounder, you might learn to stop doing it. So in part it's God's mercy that he lets us fail so that we can learn. Because if he didn't let us fail, we wouldn't learn that that was wrong. The only day we'd learn about it is at the judgment seat when everything's burnt up. So can you see that even in his temporal day-to-day judgments on us now, God is operating in mercy? Because he's teaching you by giving you a little smack that wasn't good, not to do it again. And so he's letting you fall on your face and learn not to do it again. So, even if a gift is a genuine God-given gift, it can be spoiled, and your subsequent use of that gift can be harmed and rendered perhaps even useless by the manner in which you receive that opportunity or gift. If you grab it, it's probably going to be useless from then on. Now, the demons know that perfectly well, and they will try and tempt you to grab because they are quite happy when you grab something because they know it's not going to be much use in God's kingdom if it has been grabbed. They'll want you to do it the wrong way, prematurely, at the wrong speed, in the wrong manner. They're very happy for you to pursue a ministry in those ways because it's likely to cause harm to others and give no reward to you and be of little use to God. So, That's what they'll seek to get you to do. And let's look at a classic example of someone who didn't go about it that way. It's the story of Boaz and Ruth. Now, Boaz wanted Ruth. Now, you'd imagine, if Boaz was keen to marry Ruth, wouldn't that be a situation where a little bit of grabbing would be all right? But Boaz was a godly man, and he knew that there was another who had a prior right to him. Now, what Boaz could have done was he could have gone round and let the other man's tyres down so he was late for work that day and wouldn't get to meet Ruth, and he could have done all sorts of things, couldn't he? Like Dick Dastardly or something. He could have done all sorts of Dick Dastardly type things to stop the other fella. But what did Boaz do? He kept calm. He didn't do anything to push the other man out of the way. He trusted God to arrange matters, and he didn't try to fix it all for himself. He just waited to see what would happen. Now, God wanted him to marry Ruth, but he was also being tested. So the manner in which he married Ruth was godly and right and in the spirit. And look what came of it. The kingly line was established through that. So a thing that's done in the right way will lead to good things, and a thing that's started or grabbed in the wrong way will not lead to anything of much value. So let me give you another example of someone who illustrates a point I made earlier, and that is about how God's things, the things God does, they begin small and they progress slowly. Now, if there was ever an example of this, it's Abraham. Okay? Now, I've learned this my own self in life, that God's things begin slowly and small and unimpressively, and then later become big. Fleshly things begin big and quickly, and later collapse. So look at Abraham as your classic example of this. Right? He was made a promise, wasn't he? The promise, we call it, about him being the father of multitudes. That's his name. God gave him the name, Father of Multitudes. Right, well, let's look at the development of the multitude, okay, and the time it took. So God makes the promise to Abraham when he's 75. So consider this. God waited till he was 75 to even tell him about the promise. Didn't he? Why didn't he tell him when he was 15? Why isn't God in a hurry? And the thing is, God is not in a hurry. He does things at a walking pace. And then every now and again, he does things at the speed of light. But most of the time, he does things at a walking pace. And so he tells Abraham at the age of 75, he's going to be the father of multitudes, and makes a promise to him about the land and about the people and all that. And it's marvellous. Absolutely wonderful thing, he tells him. So what does God then do? Absolutely nothing for 24 years. Now, this is the way God starts a business. So he announces the flotation of the company, and then he does nothing for 24 years at all. And then, when Abraham is 100, when he's 99, Isaac is conceived. When he's 100, Isaac is born. So now he's 100 years old, 25 years in, and he's got one son of the promise. So the multitude now is one little boy in a nappy. This is the multitude that he's been promised. All right, but let's see what God then does. After this, Isaac does not get married until he's 40. Now Abraham's 140. The multitude is still one. Okay, he then gets married, but it takes him 20 years to have a child with Rebekah. So when Abraham is 160, Esau and Jacob are born. Now Jacob is the line of the promise. So what have we got now? We've got Isaac and Jacob. So now the multitude is two. Well, this is 85 years in. Okay. Now if you want to get the picture of this, because it's easy to say these numbers and they don't sound like much, but think of it this way. The promise was made to Abraham in 1929, the year of the stock market crash. In the year 2014, the multitude is two. That's what we're saying here. And so, but what happens then? It speeds up a touch. Jacob has 12 sons, and they each have wives and children. But if we go forward, all right, 215 years after the promise was made, so go back to the year 1799, that's how long it was. From 1799 to 2014, this is the time period. In that time period, the multitude is now 70. Now, don't you think that God is in danger of contravening the Trade Descriptions Act? Because he's described it as a multitude, and it's going to be a nation, land. Wow, it's going to be great. All over the world. Well, from 1799 to 2014, we've got up to the size of 70. I mean, you wouldn't need a second bus, would you, to put them on? You'd need one bus and possibly a minibus to put the multitude on. And we're talking 215 years. But that's how God operates. But note what God does. 400 years after that, the descendants of Jacob leave Egypt. And at that time, they number about 2 million. And from then on, they grow even more numerous. Now, the thing is, what you've got to realize, when God sets a project, he has a very different timescale in mind. I would have labelled God's startup business as something of a disappointment or a bit of a flop, wouldn't you? As multitudes go, it's not really very multitudinous in the early days, is it? But that's the way God works, and it's important to recognise that. That is the way that he works. So when he's calling you to something, the strong likelihood is that's what he'll do. So he'll build a foundation. There'll be JCB. All you'll see for a long time is JCB diggers and big mounds of soil and big mounds of clay, and then the pounding of pile drivers, and nothing's happening. And then later, up it will come. But perhaps the classic example is this second one, and the final one is what Jesus did. So he came along to transform the entire world. And how did he do it? With 12 men. So he spent 3.5 years giving most of his time to 12 men. Some of his time to crowds, but most of his time to these 12. At the end of it, he got these 12 men. And that was pretty much all he had to show for it. And a whole bunch of people who'd heard of him, but he had 12 men who were on the payroll. 12 men, effectively his disciples, his real disciples. But even before he did that, he waited until he was 30 and spent time as a builder carpenter until he was 30 before he even began that. And that's the way Jesus went about building something. Slowly, deliberately, and with high quality in the beginning, with the big numbers coming later on. So, when I started my business, this latest business I had that I sold a couple of years ago, when I started it, I had 0 staff. It was just me, because the whole business began in a complete fiasco, and I left a previous business. And I started it with nothing. There were no staff, no anything at all. And I did not listen to a copy of this talk by me at the time. It wasn't available on YouTube at the time. But had it been available, it would have helped me a lot, because what I did, I grew that law firm from 0 staff to over 80 staff in 4 years. And I had a whole load of people that weren't properly trained. They weren't the right people to choose in the first place. And then God had to give me about a 10-year migraine headache as I dealt with the problems that came from having grown too quickly with badly trained, untrained, unsuitable staff at the beginning. What I should have done is started a lot slower, and then I'd have been a lot better. But my IQ in those days was quite small. Now it's quite a bit bigger. And but that is how it should have been done. So what I was doing at the time was operating in the flesh to a significant degree, because the flesh on the committee was telling me to grow rapidly. Do you see? And I, as chairman of the committee, was listening to him. If I'd listened to the Spirit would have said, remember Abraham, remember Jesus. What did they do? And I'd have said, oh, yeah, that's a good point, Spirit. Maybe I should slow down a bit. And then Spirit would say, yeah, that's a good idea. Slow down. Build a foundation first. Do you see? Now that was a classic example of me operating in the flesh at that time. Subsequently, my IQ increased. But at that time, it was being done the wrong way. Okay.
God still used it.
Oh yes, he's using it. Well, he's going to. All my goofiness gets put into my books. So it's the story of a goofy person and the things that you learn from it. Every bit of goofiness can be used because God is like a scrap metal dealer. He can make something out of anything. Any mistake, any disaster, he can turn it into something if we let him do it. Anyway, here endeth the lesson.